He placed the ring box on the table like he was returning something borrowed. Not a conversation, not an explanation, just a small velvet box sliding across polished mahogany, and 9 years of Elena Marlowe's life dismissed in under 60 seconds. Lucian Varelli didn't even look at her when he said it. The wedding is off. No apology, no hesitation. The most feared man in Manhattan, a man who had crushed rivals, buried enemies, and bent politicians to his will, couldn't hold eye contact with the woman who had saved his life 3 times, and his empire more times than either of them could count. Elena didn't scream. She didn't throw the ring back at him. She simply asked, "Why?" And Lucian said nothing, which told her everything. If you've ever sacrificed everything for someone who then handed your place to someone else without blinking, this story is going to hit differently. Stay with us until the end, because what Elena discovers will leave you speechless. And if you're new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. We drop stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The night Lucian ended it, Elena was wearing the same gray blazer she'd worn to their first real dinner together. Not because she was sentimental, but because she hadn't gone home to change. She'd come straight from a meeting with the shipping company's accountants, a 3-hour session where she'd caught a $400,000 discrepancy that 2 certified professionals had somehow missed. She was tired. Her shoulders ached. She had a coffee stain near the left cuff she kept forgetting to cover with her hand. That was the version of Elena who walked into Lucian's private office that evening. Not the polished fiancée photographed at charity galas. Not the woman rumored in certain Manhattan circles to be the brains behind the Varelli empire's sudden leap into legitimate business. Just a tired woman in a stained blazer who thought she was stopping by to go over a contract before heading home. She didn't know it was the last time she'd walk into that room as something more than a stranger. Lucian was standing near the window when she came in. He didn't turn around right away, which she noticed but didn't think much of. He was often like that, contained, deliberate, never rushing toward anything. It was one of the qualities she'd found magnetic in the beginning. A man who controlled the temperature of every room simply by deciding to. But something was different. She could feel it before she could name it. The quality of silence in the room, the way his shoulders were set, the small velvet box sitting on the desk that she clocked immediately, recognized, and then deliberately didn't look at again. "You're early," he said, still facing the window. "I came from the docs meeting, saved 40 minutes. She set her bag down on the chair she always used. "What's that on the desk?" He turned then. And Elena, who had spent 9 years reading Lucian Varelli's face the way other people read weather, scanning for the small signs that told her whether a storm was coming or passing, felt something drop in her chest. Not because he looked cruel, because he looked relieved. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He nodded once, like he'd expected that, and moved to the other side of the desk. He didn't pick up the box. He didn't open it. He just rested his hands flat on the surface and said, without preamble, without the grace of a longer sentence, "The wedding is off, Elena." She heard it, processed it, said nothing. "I've thought about this for a long time," he continued. I'm not doing this to hurt you. You're going to have to give me more than that." His jaw tightened. "There are things I need that I haven't been honest about needing. Things I convinced myself weren't important." He paused. "I was wrong." Elena looked at the box, then back at him. "What things?" He didn't answer, and that was the moment. Not the words he said, but the words he refused to say. That Elena understood this was not a conversation she was going to win, or survive intact, or walk away from unchanged. Whatever was happening, Lucian had already decided it. She was standing in the aftermath, being informed rather than consulted, and the man she had built her entire adult life alongside was watching her realize it with an expression that was equal parts guilt and finality. She picked up the box, didn't open it, just held it. 9 years, she said. "I know. I renegotiated the Ferraro agreement when you were in the hospital and couldn't sign your own name. I sat across from men who wanted you dead and smiled at them. I moved money through 6 different structures to keep the feds from finding a single transaction. 9 years, Lucian. I know what you've done. Then explain to me what you need that you couldn't have told me about." He looked away. She set the box back on the desk and walked out. She didn't cry in the elevator, didn't cry in the car, didn't cry until she was in her own bathroom with the door locked and the shower running so the sound could cover it, and even then she was furious at herself for needing the cover. She'd survived worse than this. She'd sat across from men who had implied, clearly and without much disguise, that they were considering having her killed, and she'd negotiated them back from the edge. She'd buried friends. She'd made impossible choices. She was not a woman who fell apart over a man. But this was not just a man. This was 9 years of herself. The following weeks were the strangest of Elena's life, not because they were dramatic, but because they were almost ordinary. Lucian didn't call to explain. She didn't reach out to demand an explanation. They had mutual business arrangements, legitimate companies with her name on the paperwork, and those needed to be untangled. She hired an attorney. He hired an attorney. The attorneys communicated. Money was sorted, contracts were reviewed, assets were divided with a precision that felt obscene given what they'd built together. People in Lucian's circle noticed. Of course they did. The Varelli organization was not a large anonymous corporation. It was a network of relationships, loyalties, and sharp eyes that noticed every change in the weather. Captains who had once treated Elena with careful respect became suddenly, noticeably cooler. Not hostile, just recalibrated, as if someone had quietly adjusted the rules of engagement. She understood. She had always understood how this world worked. When Lucian's favor was currency, her proximity to him had made her valuable. Without it, she was simply a woman who used to matter. She spent those weeks in her own apartment, a place she owned outright, in her name, that had nothing to do with Lucian. And she worked. She had always worked. It was the one thing about herself she'd never had to compromise. She consulted for 2 legitimate companies who had sought her out specifically, and she threw herself into that with an intensity that her assistant later described, carefully, as a little terrifying. She didn't go looking for answers. She told herself it didn't matter why. He had ended it. The specifics were irrelevant. She was wrong about that. 3 weeks after the office conversation, Elena had a meeting at the Velour, one of the Varelli-owned private clubs in Midtown that she still technically had advisory access to during the transition period. The meeting was with a financial compliance officer who reported to her in a capacity that hadn't technically expired yet. She walked in. The club was doing its usual evening business. Low lighting, expensive suits, the kind of music that costs money just to hear. She was crossing the main floor toward the private corridor when she stopped. Lucian was there. She'd known she might see him, had prepared herself for it, but she hadn't prepared herself for what was standing beside him, who was standing beside him. And she hadn't prepared herself for the stroller. It was a high-end thing, matte black, the kind of stroller that costs more than a used car. And next to Lucian, one hand resting lightly on its handle, stood a woman Elena recognized from the organization's periphery. Celeste Arden, late 20s. Beautiful in the specific way of women who understand exactly how they're being looked at. She'd been around for perhaps 8 months, affiliated with one of the ancillary businesses through an introduction. Elena had never fully traced. Lucian saw Elena the moment she stopped. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He held her gaze with the same deliberateness he applied to everything, and then, because he was Lucian Varelli, and he had never been a man who avoided what needed to be faced, or perhaps because he was a coward who preferred to deliver blows quickly rather than wait for them to land, he walked toward her. Celeste stayed where she was. Her hand didn't leave the stroller. Elena. Lucian. She matched his tone exactly, flat, even. I didn't know you'd be here tonight. Neither did I, until an hour ago. He glanced back briefly, then back at her. I should have. There are things I should have explained better. I handled it badly. You handled it badly, she repeated. Not a question, not an accusation, just the sentence held up for examination. The child, he said, and his voice changed on those 2 words in a way that years of knowing him told her was genuine. A warmth she'd heard maybe a dozen times in 9 years, surfacing only when something actually moved him. His name is Nico. He's mine, Elena. The room kept making noise around them. Glasses, conversations, music. All of it felt very far away. Yours, she said. Celeste, the situation between us it's complicated, but the boy is mine. I found out while we were still engaged. He paused. That was the 3 days. In October. When I disappeared. 3 days. October. She'd been frantic, had covered for him, told people he was managing a situation in Boston, had not slept until he reappeared on a Tuesday morning looking like someone had hollowed him out and put him back together imprecisely. You knew before you ended it, she said. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. She stood very still for a moment, and then she did something that Lucian clearly hadn't expected. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice. She walked past him to the private corridor, had her meeting, and left the club through a side exit without looking back. But on the drive home, she was thinking, not about Celeste, not even about Lucian. She was thinking about a medical file. 2 years earlier, as part of a comprehensive health review that Lucian's private physician conducted annually, the kind of review that people in his position required for insurance and operational continuity reasons, certain results had crossed Elena's desk. Not because she was supposed to see them, because she handled everything, always, and the physician's administrative assistant had attached the wrong file to an email. She'd seen the results, understood them, and she'd buried the file in a folder she never opened again, because what she'd read was something she'd told herself was private, was his, was not her information to act on. The file said, in language that was medical and therefore blunt, that Lucian Varelli's fertility was severely compromised, not impossible, but extraordinarily, statistically unlikely. She had never told him. She'd told herself it was kindness, that it was protecting him from a wound he hadn't asked to examine. Now she sat in the back of a car moving through Manhattan's wet streets, and she thought about a newborn boy sleeping in a matte black stroller, and she thought about Lucian's face when he said the boy is mine, and she thought about Celeste's hand resting on that stroller with the ease of a woman who has already won. Extraordinarily, statistically unlikely. Not impossible. But someone would need to be very, very lucky, or the child would need to belong to someone else entirely. Elena didn't say anything to anyone. She went home. She poured a glass of water because she didn't trust herself with anything stronger tonight. She sat at her kitchen table and she thought very carefully about what she knew, what she could prove, and what she was going to do about neither. She decided, in the end, to do nothing. Lucian had made his choice. He'd found something, or believed he'd found something, that she hadn't been able to give him, and he'd built a new story around it. Maybe it was true. Unlikely didn't mean impossible. She was not a DNA test. She was not his physician. She was not anymore the woman responsible for protecting him from difficult truths. She removed herself from that responsibility the same night she placed the engagement ring on his desk, quietly, completely, without a word. But the thing about letting go of a secret is that the secret doesn't let go of you. It stays, waiting. And somewhere across Manhattan, in a private club with low lighting and expensive music, a woman named Celeste stood beside a stroller with her hand on the handle and smiled at the space where Elena Marlowe had been standing. She had no idea that the woman she'd replaced was the one person in the world who knew something powerful enough to bring the whole arrangement down. She had no idea, and neither yet did Elena understand just how dark this secret was going to get. The separation agreement took 11 days to finalize. 11 days of emails between attorneys, of asset lists reviewed and revised, of Elena sitting across a conference table from a lawyer named Gerald Fitch, who smelled like cigarettes and kept calling her Ms. Marlowe, with a particular emphasis that suggested he found her presence in the negotiation slightly surprising. As if a woman walking away from Lucian Varelli with anything at all was an outcome that required explanation. She didn't correct him. She simply handed him the documentation she'd prepared herself. 3 years of financial records, contract contributions, operational frameworks she'd built from scratch, and watched his expression shift from mildly condescending to carefully neutral over the course of about 45 minutes. She walked out of that building with what was legally hers. Not everything she'd earned, but enough. Lucian's attorney had called it generous. Elena's attorney had called it a starting point. Elena had called it done and moved on. The office she rented was on the 14th floor of a building in the Flatiron District, nothing like the marble and brass headquarters she'd operated from inside Varelli Holdings. It had good light, a view of the street below, and enough space for herself and 2 assistants she hired in the first week. She put her name on the door, Marlowe Strategic Holdings, small letters, no flourish, and she started working. Two consulting clients came almost immediately, referred by contacts who'd watched her operate for years and understood exactly what they were getting. She didn't advertise. She didn't need to. The kind of problems Elena solved were the kind that people didn't post about publicly. Financial structures that needed invisible reinforcement. Partnership agreements with dangerous ambiguity written into the margins. Organizations with money moving in directions their owners hadn't authorized. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The difference was that now, when she solved a problem, the solution had her name on it instead of his. She told herself it was enough. Most days, she almost believed it. The first time she heard anything concrete about the Varelli organization, after the separation, it came from Marcus Webb, a man she'd worked with for 4 years in a compliance capacity, careful enough to survive in that world, and smart enough to know his own limits. He called her on a Thursday afternoon while she was reviewing a contract, and he didn't bother with small talk. "Celeste is running point on the Meridian deal," he said. Elena put her pen down. "What Meridian deal?" "Exactly." A pause. She introduced these people, some kind of investment intermediary, supposed to be moving capital through the real estate arm. The numbers they're showing are good, really good, too good. "How long has this been in development?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. Started about 3 weeks after you left." Another pause, longer this time. "Elena, nobody's asking the right questions." She knew what he was really saying. For 9 years, she had been the person who asked the right questions. She was the reason answers existed before problems became disasters. And now there was a gap where that function used to be, and someone had moved into the gap without the qualifications to fill it. "I'm not in a position to advise on this, Marcus." "I know. You should talk to—" "There's nobody to talk to. That's what I'm telling you." She sat with that for a moment. "Document everything you're seeing. Keep copies somewhere personal, not on company servers. That's all I can tell you." She hung up and stared at the contract on her desk without reading it for a solid 3 minutes. Then she picked up her pen and kept working. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks later. It came in a cream envelope with the Varelli family seal embossed in the upper corner. The same seal that had appeared on every formal piece of correspondence from the organization for 30 years. The same seal that had been on the invitations for her own canceled wedding. The paper was heavy. The printing was precise. It announced, in the restrained language of people who consider excess to be a private matter, that Lucian Varelli and Celeste Arden would be married on the 14th of the following month. The date hit her before the names did. The 14th. Their date. The date she and Lucian had chosen together, 18 months ago, standing in the kitchen of his Westchester house on a Sunday morning while she was trying to read a financial brief and he kept distracting her. They'd chosen it because it was the anniversary of the night they'd first had a real conversation rather than a business one. A dinner that had started as a meeting and ended 4 hours later with both of them slightly drunk on decent wine and the particular surprise of finding someone genuinely interesting across a table. She hadn't thought he remembered. He'd remembered. He'd just given the date to someone else. She set the invitation on her desk and looked at it for a long time. She wasn't going. That was clear. She had no reason to go, no obligation, no remaining connection to that world that required her presence at Lucian Varelli's second engagement celebration. She was going to put the invitation in the recycling and forget it existed. She was still thinking this when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved. "You should come. I'd love to meet you properly." "See." Elena stared at the message. "Celeste." She put the phone face down on the desk, stood up, and walked to the window. 14 floors below, the street was doing its ordinary Thursday business. People moving, cars stopping, the general low-grade noise of a city that didn't care what was happening in her chest. She picked the phone back up. She did not respond, but she also did not throw the invitation away. It was 3 days later that she saw them. She'd been walking back from a meeting in Midtown, a meeting that had run long and left her with the particular tiredness of having been professionally pleasant for 2 hours straight, when she passed the Cavendish, a boutique hotel on 54th Street that she knew mostly because Lucian had used it occasionally for meetings that didn't need to appear in any calendar. She almost didn't look. She was thinking about the meeting, about a clause in the agreement that needed revision, about whether her assistant had sent the follow-up email. She was not thinking about Lucian or Celeste or any of it, but she looked. Maybe it was the car, a dark sedan she half recognized, parked with the particular deliberateness of a vehicle whose driver is being paid to wait. Maybe it was instinct. 9 years of watching for the things that didn't fit had left her with a habit of noticing. She stopped walking. Celeste came through the hotel's side door first. She was dressed carefully, the way she always seemed to be dressed, like going anywhere required advanced preparation. She had sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, which told Elena something by itself. Then the man behind her. Elena recognized him before she could stop herself. Dominic Varelli, 63 years old, Lucian's father. The man who had built the original Varelli operation with his hands and his particular brand of controlled violence before handing it to his son and stepping into the role of senior advisor. A position that meant he went to fewer meetings and attended more dinners and was consulted on large decisions and otherwise kept a respectful distance from daily operations. A man who in 9 years had treated Elena with the careful civility of someone who has decided a person is useful without being important. He put his hand on the small of Celeste's back, and then he kissed her. Not a greeting, not a social thing. A kiss that had history in it. Elena stood on the sidewalk and felt something cold move through her. She walked away before either of them turned around, kept her pace even, didn't look back, turned the corner and stood with her back against the building wall for a moment, just breathing. Her mind was already working, not emotionally, clinically. The part of her brain that had assessed situations and calculated implications for 9 years activated without her asking it to, and she stood on a midtown street corner and let it run. Dominic and Celeste, a relationship that had history, that operated out of the Cavendish, a hotel chosen for its discretion. A woman who had appeared in Lucian's life 8 months ago with an introduction that Elena had never fully traced. A baby boy. Extraordinarily, statistically unlikely. She walked the rest of the way back to her office with her jaw set and her hands very steady, and she sat down at her desk and opened her contacts and made a call. The investigator's name was Petra Solis. She was 51 years old, former federal, currently private, and she had done work for Elena twice before, both times efficiently and without asking questions that weren't her business. She answered on the second ring. "I need a timeline," Elena said. "2 people. I need to know when they started, how often they meet, and where." "Names?" Elena gave them. A pause. "Dominic Varelli." "Yes." Another pause, longer. Elena waited. "My rate goes up for that name." "I know. Oh, send me the new number." She hung up and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought very carefully about what she was doing. She was not doing this for Lucian. She was clear about that. Whatever happened to Lucian and his new family and his empire was not her responsibility anymore. She had walked away from that. She had signed papers that confirmed she had walked away from that. But there was a child. An infant named Nico who was sleeping in a luxury apartment somewhere in Manhattan while the adults around him constructed an architecture of lies and called it a family. And there was Lucian, infuriating, proud, impossible Lucian, who was about to marry a woman while believing that the child he was claiming as his heir was biologically his son. The medical file lived in a folder on a hard drive in a drawer in her desk. She pulled the drawer open, looked at the drive, closed the drawer again. Not yet. Petra called back in 4 days. Elena took the meeting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from her office, a place with enough ambient noise that a conversation could happen without being heard by the tables on either side. Petra slid a folder across the table. 14 confirmed meetings over the past 11 months, she said, keeping her voice level and her eyes on the table. 6 at the Cavendish, 4 at a property in Westchester registered to an LLC that traces back to a holding company connected to Dominic's personal assets. The others were in transit, car to car, that kind of thing. She tapped the folder. The timing on 2 of those meetings puts them together approximately 9 to 10 months before the child was born. Elena opened the folder. Photographs. Dates. A few captured text messages obtained through means she chose not to examine too carefully. The woman in these photos, she was introduced to Lucian's organization through a referral. Do you have anything on who made that referral? Petra's expression didn't change, but something shifted slightly. The referral came through a business contact of Dominic's. Someone who operates in real estate has done work for the Varelli family for about 8 years. She paused. It wasn't a coincidence. Elena looked at a photograph. Dominic and Celeste at a table by a window, his hand over hers. His expression was something she'd never seen on his face in 9 years of knowing him. Open, unguarded, something almost soft. The expression of a man who is being seen in a way he doesn't usually allow. "He brought her in," Elena said. "Looks that way." "To Lucian." "To Lucian's organization, yes." Elena closed the folder. She sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the specific ugliness of what it implied. A father who had arranged for a woman to enter his son's life, who had continued a relationship with that woman throughout, who had then celebrated the arrival of a child he publicly called his grandchild. She thought about Dominic at the announcement dinner she'd heard about secondhand, standing beside Lucian, raising a glass, calling Nico the future of the Varelli name. She thought about how that toast must have felt coming out of his mouth, what it cost him to say it, or whether it cost him anything at all. "What do you want to do with this?" Petra asked. "Nothing yet." "Okay. Keep the files secure. Send me the digital copies on the encrypted channel." Petra nodded, finished her coffee, left without ceremony. Elena sat with the folder for another few minutes, then put it in her bag and walked back to her office. She was going to send it to Lucian. Not because she wanted to hurt him, not because she wanted him back, but because a man was about to legally bind himself to a situation built entirely on a deception that had been engineered by someone he trusted absolutely. And whatever Elena felt about Lucian Varelli personally, she had spent 9 years believing that truth mattered. She composed the message herself. Short. No commentary. The digital file attached, the investigator's documentation included, and a single sentence at the end. "Before the wedding, you should know this." She sent it on a Wednesday evening at 7:15 from her personal address, and then she put her phone in her desk drawer so she wouldn't watch it not respond. Lucian called at 10:42. She answered. "Where did you get this?" Not a question. A statement made through teeth she could hear pressed together. "It doesn't matter where." "Elena." His voice was a controlled version of something that wanted very badly not to be controlled. "Where did you get this?" "I saw them. 3 weeks ago, outside the Cavendish. I hired someone to confirm what I saw." Silence on the line. She could hear him breathing. He had a particular way of breathing when he was holding something down, shallow, deliberate, like he was rationing air. "You're doing this because you can't handle it," he said finally. "That's what this is." She felt something flare in her chest and deliberately let it settle before she spoke. "I'm doing this because your father brought that woman into your organization. The timeline on those photographs puts them together before Nico was born. Look at the dates, Lucian. Actually look at them." "I have." And I think you hired someone to manufacture a timeline that—" "Stop." Her voice came out harder than she'd intended. "You know me. Whatever else you think about me right now, you know me. I don't manufacture evidence. I never have. Not once in 9 years. Silence. "Get a DNA test," she said. "That's all I'm asking. Before you marry her, before you stand up in front of everyone and declare that child your heir, get the test." Another silence, longer. "You know what I think?" His voice had gone very quiet, which was never a good sign with Lucian. Quiet meant he'd moved past the first layer of anger into something colder. "I think you spent 9 years knowing something about me, about my situation, and you never said a word. You let me think it was you. For 9 years, Elena, you let me believe that the problem was yours." She didn't respond immediately, because he wasn't wrong. "That's a different conversation," she said finally. Is it? Is it a different conversation?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and that sound, that small fracture in the controlled surface, was the most honest thing she'd heard from him in months. "You're asking me to trust your evidence while you've been sitting on information that changed everything, that could have changed everything. Lucian, don't." The word landed flat. "Don't do that thing where you explain it so it makes sense. I can't—" He stopped, started again. "I need you to stay away from the wedding." The line went dead. Elena set the phone on her desk and looked at her hands. He wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to get the test, wasn't going to look clearly at the photographs, wasn't going to let himself sit with the possibility because the possibility was unbearable. And Lucian Varelli had always handled unbearable things by refusing to look at them directly. She had known this about him, had always known it. It was the thing she'd spent 9 years quietly compensating for. the blind spots created by pride, by the particular armor of a man who had built his entire identity around being the one who was never deceived. She should let it go. She had sent the evidence. She had done what she could. Whatever happened next was not her responsibility. She almost convinced herself of this. Then Celeste's message arrived. 11:17 at night, the same number as before. I heard you spoke to him. You're embarrassing yourself. Come to the wedding. Watch him choose me in front of everyone who used to respect you. Or are you afraid? Elena read it twice. She put the phone down, picked it up, typed one word, fine. And the moment she sent it, she understood that whatever had been happening before, the clean separation, the professional distance, the careful management of what she felt versus what she showed, was over. She had just accepted an invitation to walk into a room where the most powerful people in Lucian Varelli's world would be assembled, where her presence would be read as weakness by most of them, where Celeste would have every structural advantage, and where Lucian might very well use her as an example of everything he'd moved past. She had accepted because she was tired of being careful. But somewhere underneath the anger, underneath the exhaustion of the past months, something else was moving, quiet, patient. She opened the drawer. She took out the hard drive. She held it in her hand for a moment and thought about Serafina Varelli, Lucian's mother, 70 years old, a woman who had kept the Varelli family functional through decades of violence, losses, and near disasters through sheer force of accumulated wisdom and the particular authority of someone who has watched everything fall apart and helped put it back together anyway. Serafina had always treated Elena with something that wasn't quite warmth, but was very close to respect. Not the respect of people who found her useful, the respect of one capable woman for another. Elena thought about Serafina sitting at a wedding reception, watching her husband raise a glass to a grandson who was not his grandson in the way he was claiming. She thought about what Serafina deserved to know. She put the drive in her bag. She was going to the wedding, and she was not going to arrive empty-handed. She bought a dress she didn't already own. That was the first decision, and it was deliberate. Everything in her existing wardrobe carried some memory of the life she'd been living. Event clothes purchased for Varelli dinners, professional pieces selected to project competence without drawing attention, the careful wardrobe of a woman who had understood that her job was to support a presence rather than create one. She bought something different. Dark navy, structured, the kind of cut that didn't apologize for itself. She paid for it in cash from her personal account and hung it on the back of her office door for 3 days before the wedding, where she could see it every morning when she came in. It was a reminder, not of what she'd lost, of what she was walking into. She didn't sleep well the night before. That wasn't unusual. She hadn't slept well consistently in months. But this was a specific kind of wakefulness, the kind where her mind kept running the same sequence of calculations without arriving at new answers. What she would say to Serafina, how much to show her, whether Serafina would act on it or absorb it quietly and do nothing, which was also possible. Serafina Varelli had survived 60 years in proximity to this world by knowing when to move and when to wait, and Elena couldn't predict which way she'd go. She arrived at the estate by car, alone, 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The property was on the water, an hour outside the city, a place she knew well because it had been the site of several Varelli family events over the years, and because it was supposed to have been the site of her own wedding to Lucian. Standing at the gate and watching the security team wave her through felt like a specific kind of cruelty, the kind that wasn't personal, but landed personally anyway. The grounds were extraordinary. She'd always thought so. Whoever had designed the landscaping understood something about controlled wildness, the way things could look almost natural while being entirely intentional. Tonight, the whole property was lit with warm light strung through the trees, and there were hundreds of people moving through it, the particular density of a gathering that represented real power. Politicians she recognized, business figures, family captains in expensive suits who wore their authority the way other men wore watches, constant, functional, a signal to anyone paying attention. She was paying attention. She saw 3 people clock her arrival in the first 90 seconds. A captain named Rourke, who had always been wary of her, now watching her cross the entrance path with an expression that was not quite hostile but was absolutely tracking. A woman named Sandra Fitch, no relation to the attorney, who handled public relations for the legitimate businesses and who looked genuinely startled, as if she'd expected Elena to have the decency not to show up. And one of Dominic's personal associates, a man whose name she'd never learned, who turned away too quickly when she looked in his direction. She found Serafina Varelli near the garden wall, standing slightly apart from a group of relatives, holding a glass of sparkling water and watching the crowd with the particular expression of a woman who has attended so many of these events that she has moved past feeling anything specific about them. Serafina was wearing dark green. Her hair was set the way it always was, perfectly controlled, and she had the pearls on that Elena had seen at every formal occasion for 9 years. Not ostentatious, simply always present, like a signature. She saw Elena coming and didn't move. Didn't signal anything with her face. Just watched her approach the way she watched most things, with patience that could be mistaken for indifference by people who didn't know the difference. Elena. Her voice was low, unhurried. Serafina. Elena stopped a comfortable distance away and didn't offer a social kiss, which Serafina clearly noted and didn't comment on. You look well. I look exactly as I look. You're thinner than you were. I've been working a lot. Serafina glanced at the crowd briefly, then back. Why are you here? No preamble. Elena respected that more than she could say. I have something you need to see before the ceremony begins, Elena said. I wouldn't be here otherwise, you know that. A pause. Serafina's eyes moved over her face with the careful attention of someone reading a document for inconsistencies. Show me, she said. Elena opened her bag. She'd printed the photographs, the Cavendish, the Westchester property, the captured messages, Petra's documented timeline laid out on 3 clean pages. She'd debated bringing the medical file and decided against it. That was Lucian's to know in his own time, in a way she could control. What she was giving Serafina was simpler and more immediate, evidence of a relationship that had existed before Nico was born and had continued since. She held the photographs out. Serafina took them. She looked at the first one for a long time, then the second. Then she moved through the rest with a steadiness that Elena found almost frightening, not because it suggested she didn't feel anything, but because it suggested she was feeling something very large and containing it through an act of sustained will. When she reached the last page, she stood very still for a moment. How long have you known? She asked. About the photographs, 3 weeks. About the relationship. I confirmed the timeline recently. And before that? Elena understood what she was asking. I knew something else, something separate. I'm telling Lucian that part directly. Serafina looked at her then with an expression that Elena had never seen on her face in 9 years. Not anger, not grief exactly, but something that was the compound of both, the specific devastation of a woman who has suspected something without proof, and is now holding the proof in her hands, and discovering that confirmation is not the same as preparation. My husband, Serafina said. Not a question, not quite a statement, just the words, placed carefully in the air between them. I'm sorry, Elena said. Serafina folded the photographs with precise, controlled movements, creased them sharply, and placed them in the small clutch bag she was carrying. She handed back the Petra's notes but kept the photographs. Then she straightened. Thank you for bringing this to me, she said. And then, without another word, she turned back toward the crowd with her sparkling water in hand and her posture perfectly correct, and Elena watched her cross the garden toward the family seating area looking exactly the same as she had 30 seconds ago. That was Serafina Varelli. Elena released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She found a seat near the back of the ceremony arrangement, among the business associates and the more peripheral guests, where she had a clear view of the front but could leave if she needed to. She did not want to leave. She had come to see something through, though she was still working out exactly what she meant by that. The ceremony was Lucian at his most composed. She'd known it would be. Whatever was happening internally, and she'd sent him evidence 3 weeks ago that she knew had torn something open in him. He was a man who understood that how you appeared in front of your organization was its own form of authority. He stood at the front in a dark suit that fit him with the precision of something made specifically for his body, which it had been, and he looked out at the assembled crowd with the calm of a man who has made a decision and intends to honor it. Celeste was extraordinary. Elena had to give her that. The dress was perfect. The timing was perfect. The small smile she wore as she walked toward Lucian was calibrated precisely between triumph and tenderness. She was performing warmth for an audience that needed to believe in it, and she was doing it very, very well. Elena watched Lucian's face as Celeste approached. She was looking for doubt. for the flicker that would tell her he'd looked at those photographs and felt the ground shift. It wasn't there. Or if it was, he had buried it under the collected discipline of 35 years of learning not to show weakness in public. The ceremony itself was brief. Deliberate vows, exchanged in the quiet voice of two people who understand that the words are a formality and the real contract was signed somewhere else. A ring placed, a moment held for the guests. Applause. Elena's hands were in her lap. The reception moved the crowd toward a series of long tables arranged facing the water, with the estate lit behind them in that warm, deliberate gold. And by the time Elena found her assigned seat, which was, she noted, at a table positioned with the careful precision of someone who wanted her visible but not central, the evening had shifted into the particular rhythm of a formal celebration at full momentum. Food arrived. Wine moved. Toasts were made by men who spoke in the careful language of people who choose every word, knowing it may be repeated somewhere it wasn't meant to reach. Lucian was at the head table with Celeste beside him, and Nico, the baby, who had been brought in by a woman Elena assumed was a nanny, positioned in a high-end portable setup to Lucian's left. Dominic sat 3 seats down from Lucian, slightly separated from Serafina by the arrangement of other family members. Elena watched Serafina. Throughout the first hour of the reception, Serafina did what she always did at these events. Engaged guests, responded to toasts, navigated the social geography of a large, powerful gathering with the ease of long practice. She laughed at the right moments. She touched arms. She was gracious and unhurried. But twice, Elena caught her looking at Dominic. Not the look of a wife checking on a husband at a crowded party. Something else. Something that lasted 2 seconds too long and ended when Dominic turned and she shifted her gaze elsewhere with the smoothness of someone who has had a long time to practice not being caught looking at something. The first toast that made Elena's stomach tighten was from one of Lucian's longtime captains, a man named Benedetto, who had been with the organization for 20 years and who gave toast the way he did most things, with a bluntness that operated as its own kind of elegance. He stood, raised his glass, said something about legacy and continuity, and what it meant to a man to see his name go forward, and he looked at Nico while he said it in a way that made the room feel the weight of what was really being celebrated. The applause was genuine. Dominic smiled into his glass. Then Lucian stood. Elena's shoulders went rigid. He spoke the way he always spoke to rooms full of people who depended on him, not with volume, but with a quality of attention that made everyone feel specifically addressed. He talked about what he'd built, about the years it had taken, about the people who had helped him build it. He didn't look at Elena. She was aware of the not looking the same way she was aware of the temperature of the room. Then he picked up Nico. The baby stirred slightly, resettled, and Lucian held him with the particular careful steadiness of a man who has taught himself something new and is still aware of the effort required. He looked at the child, and then he looked out at the assembled room. "Everything I have built," he said, "will belong to this boy." The room responded with the kind of sound that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite silence. Collective exhale of recognition, of power acknowledging itself. Then Lucian looked at Elena, direct, deliberate. The look of a man who has made a decision about what he wants to communicate. "Some people," he said, and his voice was still even, still controlled, "believe that a man doesn't know what he needs until he loses the version of it he thought he had." He paused. "I know what I need now. A family. A real one." Another pause. "Not everyone was able to give me that." The room was very quiet. Celeste had her hand on his arm. Elena sat with her spine straight and her hands flat on the table, and she did not look away, because looking away was the one thing she refused to give him tonight. There were people at surrounding tables who glanced at her. She felt it without seeing it, the peripheral awareness of being watched for a reaction. She gave them nothing. Lucian looked away first. He sat down. The room resumed its noise. Elena picked up her water glass and took a slow drink and set it back down, and she breathed, and she thought about nothing specific for about 45 seconds, which was all she could afford. Then the screen changed. There was a large display behind the head table, one of those enormous setups that had been running a rotating gallery of photographs throughout the evening, family images, celebratory portraits, the kind of retrospective that weddings in this world always featured. It had been running quietly in the background, largely ignored after the first 20 minutes. The screen went dark. Then one photograph appeared. Not a family portrait, not a celebration image. Dominic and Celeste, at a table by a window, his hand covering hers. Elena felt her breath stop. The murmuring started immediately. A low, confused sound running through the nearest tables, people looking up from conversations, recalibrating what they were seeing. Then the next photograph. Dominic's face turned toward Celeste's, his expression open and unguarded in the way Elena had seen in Petra's file. The expression of a man allowing himself to be seen in a way he normally didn't. The murmuring became something louder. Celeste had gone completely still at the head table. Dominic had not moved. Lucian was looking at the screen. The third photograph appeared. Dominic holding Nico. Celeste's arms around him from behind. The three of them composed in the specific intimacy of a private moment that had not been intended for any audience. The room was loud now. Not applause, not celebration, but the confused, fractured noise of 200 people simultaneously trying to understand what they were seeing and what it meant. Lucian set Nico down with very careful hands. He passed the baby to the nanny beside him with a precise, controlled motion that looked nothing like what it was, which was a man trying not to drop something because his hands were shaking. He stood up. He looked at the screen for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and looked at his father. Dominic's face had done something Elena had never seen it do in 9 years. It had collapsed. Not dramatically, not the collapse of a man in a film, nothing theatrical about it. Just the small, precise failure of a controlled surface when the thing holding it up suddenly gives way. His jaw was slightly loose. His eyes had a quality of being present in the room while also having gone somewhere very far away. Dominic. Lucian's voice came out in the register he almost never used publicly. The one below the controlled presentation, the one that his most trusted lieutenants had heard occasionally and described afterward with the specific restraint of people who understood what they'd witnessed. "Stand up!" Dominic didn't move. Celeste made a sound that wasn't a word. She pushed back from the table and stood and looked at the screen, and then at Lucian, and her mouth opened, and what came out was a single syllable of denial that didn't form into an actual sentence. "Whose idea was the screen?" someone said, close to Elena's table. She didn't know who. She was watching Lucian. He had turned from Dominic and was now looking at Nico, at the nanny holding Nico, at the child who was awake now and mildly displeased about the noise, doing what infants do when a room full of adults becomes too loud, making small, unhappy sounds, completely indifferent to the disaster organized around him. Lucian's expression did something then that Elena had seen exactly once in 9 years. At a hospital, 3 years ago, when he'd received news about a man he'd trusted completely, and the trust had proven catastrophically misplaced. An expression that was not anger, and was not grief, and was not shock individually, but it was all three compressed into something that had no precise name. He sat back down. He sat down, and he looked at his hands on the table, and he did not speak, and he did not look at his father, and he did not look at Celeste. And the room continued its fractured noise around him. Serafina was standing. She had risen at some point in the past 90 seconds, and Elena hadn't seen it happen, had been too focused on Lucian. And now Serafina was standing at her place at the family table with her sparkling water still in her hand, her posture precisely as it had been all evening, looking at the screen with an expression Elena would never be able to fully describe and didn't try. She looked at Dominic. "Sit down," she said to the room in general, at a volume that somehow carried. People sat. Then she walked out. Not fast, not dramatically. She simply turned from the table and walked toward the estate's interior with the measured pace of a woman who goes exactly as fast as she has decided to go and not a step faster. The room watched her leave in silence. Dominic put his hands flat on the table. His mouth moved once without producing sound, then again. Celeste said, "Lucian, please listen. This isn't—" "Don't." The word came from Lucian without him looking up, still looking at his hands. "Don't speak right now. You need to understand what you're seeing isn't—" "I said don't." His voice on the second one had gone somewhere that made the two nearest captains at adjacent tables shift their weight almost imperceptibly. The specific physical response of men whose bodies know what that tone precedes. Celeste sat down. Then Lucian slowly turned his head and looked at Nico again. The baby had calmed slightly, was making small exploratory sounds. was doing what infants do when held by someone steady, settling into the warmth of the person holding them, uninterested in everything else. Lucian looked at this child he had declared his heir 20 minutes ago in front of every person who mattered in his world. His jaw worked once. Then he said, quietly enough that Elena could barely hear it from her table, but she could read it, "Whose son is he?" Nobody answered, because nobody at that table, in that moment, was willing to be the one to say what half the room had already understood. Elena sat very still. She had thought, when she'd made the decision to come, when she'd handed Serafina the photographs, when she'd accepted Celeste's challenge, she had thought that she knew what this night would look like. She had a shape for it in her mind, a version where the truth emerged and Lucian faced it, and some form of reckoning occurred. She had not thought about what it would actually feel like to watch him sitting at a wedding table with his hands flat in front of him, looking at a baby he'd loved for 3 months without knowing what he was loving, in front of 200 people who were all watching him understand something that was going to rearrange everything. She had not let herself think about that, because if she'd thought about it, she might not have come. And the truth needed to be in that room. She stood up, not dramatically, pushed her chair back and stood and picked up her bag, and she was going to leave. She had done what she came to do. She did not need to watch the next hour of this unfold from a ringside seat. But as she turned toward the exit path, her eyes caught someone moving through the crowd toward her. Marcus Webb. He was moving with the contained urgency of a man who needs to deliver information and can't run, reaching her in 20 seconds and positioning himself close enough to speak without being overheard. "The Meridian deal," he said. "Not now, Marcus." "Elena." His voice was low and tight. "The money is gone. All of it. The intermediaries, they're not real. The companies they pointed to don't exist. It's been draining for 4 weeks and nobody caught it because Celeste had access to the monitoring systems and He stopped, collected himself. "It's not just money. There are regulators. Someone tipped them. The legitimate companies are going to be examined starting Monday." Elena looked at him. "How much?" she asked. "What's been confirmed so far? Somewhere between 8 and 12 million. But there are structures underneath that nobody's fully mapped yet." He paused. "It could be worse." She stood in the middle of a wedding reception while 200 people processed a public exposure of the groom's father and the bride, and she thought about the Varelli legitimate empire, the restaurants, the real estate, the shipping companies, the private clubs, the architecture she had spent years building with meticulous care, the structures designed to withstand exactly this kind of pressure. And she thought about those structures having been quietly hollowed out over the past months by a woman who understood just enough about how they worked to damage them without understanding how to maintain them. "What does Lucian know?" she asked. "Nothing yet. He's been—" Marcus gestured vaguely at the chaos of the room behind them. Elena looked at her bag, at the hard drive inside it, at the weight of the medical file she hadn't given to Serafina. She thought about walking out. She thought about Marlowe's strategic holdings on the 14th floor of the Flatiron building, her name on the door, her work on the desk, her life that was finally only hers. She thought about an empire she'd built for someone else being quietly dismantled, while that someone else was distracted by a lie she'd known about, and said nothing and done nothing, and convinced herself it was kindness. Her hands weren't shaking. That surprised her. She had expected, if she ever found herself standing at this particular intersection, where her past life and her present one collided in a way that required a choice about what she was going to do, she had expected to feel something dramatic, fear or relief, or the specific vertigo of a decision that changes everything. Instead, she felt very clear. "Tell me everything you know about the Meridian structure," she said to Marcus. He started talking, and Elena stood in the middle of a ruined wedding reception with 200 witnesses to a deception that had just cracked open. And she listened, and she thought, and she began to understand that the next move she made was not going to be about Lucian at all. It was going to be about what happened to the people underneath him when the empire above them started coming down. The real workers, the legitimate employees, the hundreds of people who had nothing to do with any of this, and whose livelihoods were structured inside a set of companies that were about to be looked at very carefully by people with federal authority. She had built those structures. She knew every corner of them. And the woman who had dismantled the safeguards had not been careful enough, or smart enough, or ruthless enough to make the damage irreversible. Not yet. But Monday was coming fast. Elena looked toward the head table, where Lucian was still seated with his hands flat on the surface and his face the color of a man who has stepped off something and hasn't hit the ground yet. Then she looked at the exit. Then she took her phone out of her bag and called her attorney. "I need you to file a notification of advisory intervention with the Varelli Holdings Board by 8 a.m. Monday," she said when he answered. "Temporary, formal, documented. I'll explain everything when I see you tomorrow morning." "Elena, I know what time it is. File it." She hung up. She had not decided to save Lucian. She had decided to save the work. There was a difference, and she held on to it, because in the next 72 hours she was going to need every clear distinction she could find between what she was doing and what it looked like she was doing, and the line between those two things was going to be very thin, and she was going to have to walk it without flinching while everything around her burned at a temperature she had never personally managed before. She put her phone in her bag. She looked at the water, visible beyond the estate's lit grounds, dark and level and utterly indifferent to all of it. Then Elena Marlowe turned back toward the fire. She was at her attorney's office by 7:15 Sunday morning. He was already there when she arrived, which told her he'd been there since earlier than that, which told her he understood the gravity of what she'd asked for. Gerald Fitch, not her divorce attorney, a different Gerald, a corporate one she'd retained 3 years ago for legitimate business work, and who had the particular quality of a man who could absorb alarming information without visibly alarming, had coffee waiting and a yellow legal pad already half covered in notes. "Walk me through it," he said before she'd sat down. She walked him through it, all of it. The meridian structure as Marcus had described it, the fraudulent intermediaries, the monitoring systems that Celeste had accessed, the 4 weeks of drainage that nobody had caught, the regulatory notification that was coming Monday, the legitimate companies, the restaurants, the real estate holdings, the shipping arm, the private clubs, and exactly which of their compliance structures she had built and therefore knew, and exactly which of those structures had been quietly dismantled or bypassed in the past 3 months. Gerald listened without interrupting. He wrote things down. His coffee went cold. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment, then at her. You understand what you're doing," he said. It was not a question. "Filing a formal advisory intervention on behalf of the board members who are not in the family, who have legitimate standing and who are about to be exposed to federal scrutiny for decisions they didn't make and weren't informed of. Yes. And you understand how it looks. Like I'm walking back in to save the man who publicly humiliated me at his own wedding to another woman 12 hours ago. Yes, I understand how it looks." Gerald tapped his pen against the legal pad twice. "The board will question your standing. I maintained an advisory contract with 2 board members during the separation process. It was documented. I have the correspondence. They'll question your motives. Let them. The companies are real. The employees are real. The exposure is real. If the motive is in question but the work is correct, I'll take that trade." She paused. "File the notification, Gerald." He filed it at 7:58 a.m. She spent the rest of Sunday in her office, not at Lucian's headquarters, not in any space connected to the Varelli name, in her own office on the 14th floor of the Flatiron Building, at her own desk, with her own files, working through the documentation of the meridian structure with the focused attention of someone diffusing something that will not wait for them to be ready. Marcus had sent her everything he had overnight, 4 separate encrypted files, each one more detailed than the last. The accumulated documentation of a man who had been watching something go wrong for weeks and recording it because he understood that recorded evidence is the only currency that holds its value in a crisis. She worked for 11 hours straight. She ate half a sandwich her assistant brought and forgot the other half. She drank 4 cups of coffee and wished each of them were something else and drank them anyway. She called 2 of the legitimate company's accountants. Careful calls, framed as advisory questions, nothing that committed anyone to anything yet. And she confirmed what Marcus had told her and then some. Nothing that committed anyone to anything yet. And she confirmed what Marcus had told her and then some. The meridian structure was not just fraudulent. It was specifically, surgically designed to be difficult to trace quickly. Whoever had set it up, and Celeste had not set it up alone, that was clear. Someone with significant financial architecture knowledge had built the underlying mechanism, had understood exactly how the Varelli legitimate companies monitored their capital flows, and had designed the drainage to stay below the thresholds that would trigger automatic flags. It would have worked. For another 2 or 3 months, it would have continued working, and by the time it was discovered through normal processes, the damage would have been catastrophic, and the regulatory exposure would have been insurmountable. Someone had tipped the regulators early. Elena didn't know who. She filed that question in the back of her mind and kept working. By 9 p.m. Sunday, she had a preliminary map of the damage and a proposed remediation structure. Not a solution, not yet, but a documented framework for limiting the regulatory exposure and demonstrating good faith to the investigators, which was the most critical thing in the first 72 hours. She sent it to Gerald. She sent a copy to the 2 board members. She sent a third copy to an email address she hadn't used in 4 months. Lucian's personal address. She didn't add a message, just the document. She went home at 10:30, slept 4 hours, and was back at 7. His call came at 7:22 Monday morning. She was on her second coffee, reviewing a contract clause that had nothing to do with any of this, because the rest of her work still existed and still needed to happen. She answered. Neither of them said anything for 3 seconds. "You filed with the board," he said. "Yes." "Without calling me first." "I tried calling you last night." This was true. She'd tried once, at 8 p.m., gotten voicemail, left no message. The filing needed to happen before the regulators made contact this morning. A pause. "They called at 7. "I know." "Of course you know." Not acidic, just tired. He sounded like a man who had not slept, which she assumed was accurate. "What does your filing give you?" "Access to the financial documentation and the ability to present the remediation framework to the investigators as an authorized party. It protects the board members who had no knowledge of the fraud, and it gives your legitimate companies a coherent response to show instead of silence." She paused. "It gives you about 72 hours before the exposure becomes unmanageable." Another pause. Longer. "Why?" he asked. She knew what he was asking, not the procedural why. Why the filing? Why now? The other why. The underneath one. "Because I built those companies," she said. "Because there are people who work in them who don't know any of this exists and don't deserve to lose their jobs over it." She paused again. "And because it was the right thing to do, that's all." The line was quiet for a moment. "I need to see you," he said. "I know, not here, not your office, somewhere neutral." "The Flatiron Building, your office. 11. "Fine." She hung up and stared at the wall for 30 seconds, then went back to the contract clause. He arrived at 11:03 with 2 men she didn't recognize stationed in the lobby, which she noted without commenting on. He came upstairs alone. She had her assistant step out before he arrived, which meant when he walked through the door, it was just the 2 of them and the city visible through the windows and the specific quality of air in a room where something significant is about to happen. He looked terrible. She registered this with the part of her that still knew his face better than she knew most things in the world, the part that had not successfully completed its intended process of becoming indifferent. He was wearing yesterday's suit, or one that looked like it. His jaw carried more than overnight stubble. His eyes had the particular flatness of someone who has been awake long enough that the surface emotions have worn off, and what remains is the unprocessed sediment of everything underneath. He looked at her office, at her name on the door, at the desk, and the files and the city behind her. "You've been working," he said, "always." He sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited, which was the most normal thing he'd done in months, and she felt something complicated move through her and let it pass. "Celeste is gone," he said. "Where?" "I don't know. Her apartment is cleared. She had the presence of mind to leave before I had the conversation I needed to have with her." His jaw tightened. She was smart enough to know the conversation was coming. "And Dominic?" A pause that had weight to it. "My father and I have spoken." He stopped there, and she understood he wasn't going to give her more than that right now, and she didn't push. "The baby," she said carefully. "Nico is with the nanny. He's—" Lucian stopped. Something crossed his face that she had no word for. "He's fine. He's 3 months old. He doesn't know anything." He said this last part very quietly, almost to himself. "He doesn't know anything." She waited. "I need to know about the medical file," he said. The room felt like it contracted slightly. "How do you know about the medical file?" Because I'm not stupid, Elena. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd walked in. You sent me the photographs. You told me to get a DNA test. You already knew about Celeste and my father, which means you already suspected Nico wasn't mine, which means you had a reason to suspect it that went beyond what you saw outside the Cavendish. He paused. The only thing that makes sense is that you knew something about my medical situation. She held his gaze. How long have you known? He asked. 2 years? The words landed in the room, and neither of them moved. 2 years, he repeated. An administrative error. Your physician's office sent a document to a shared email account. I saw the results. I should have told you. I didn't. She kept her voice steady. I told myself I was protecting you. That was partly true. I was also... She stopped, made herself finish it. I was afraid of what it would mean for us if you knew. That was the real reason, and I was wrong to make that choice. Lucian sat very still. For 2 years, he said slowly, you knew that the chances of me fathering a child were extremely low. Not impossible, extremely low. And when Celeste told me she was pregnant, I was gone by then. We were already separated. But you knew when I told you in the club, when I said Nico was mine. His voice was developing a quality she recognized. Not anger yet, something preceding anger, the low-pressure system before the storm. You knew standing right there that the odds were yes. And you said nothing. I had just watched you end a 9-year relationship and introduce me to the woman and the baby you were replacing me with. No, I said nothing. He stood up. She had expected this. She didn't move. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and the way he was breathing, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would be more useful than the silence. I spent 9 years, he said to the window, thinking the problem was yours. I know. I thought... He stopped. There were things I thought about you, about why you... I told myself you didn't want children, that you were too focused on the work, that you had decided against it and were too controlled to admit that it mattered. He turned around. I blamed you. For 9 years I blamed you for something that was mine. And I let you, she said. I let you because I thought protecting your pride was the same as protecting you. It wasn't. That was my mistake. He looked at her with an expression that was so many things at once that she couldn't read it as a single emotion, anger and grief, and something that might have been, underneath all of it, a terrible relieved recognition of a truth that had been waiting to be spoken for too long. You should have told me, he said. Yes. That's all you're giving me? Yes? What do you want me to give you, Lucian? Her voice came out steady but not soft. I made a mistake. A serious one. I've known it since the night you told me about Nico. I should have told you years ago. I was wrong. That's true. It's also true that you spent 9 years assuming, without ever asking me directly, that your fertility wasn't the issue. You never went back to the doctor. You never had the conversation with me. You assumed. And when Celeste appeared with a baby you assumed was yours, you didn't question it for 1 second. She paused. We both failed at telling the truth. I just did it longer. His jaw worked. Get the DNA test, she said. You know you need to. You've known since Saturday night. He pulled out his phone and showed her a message. A result from a private medical facility, time-stamped 6:40 a.m. She read it. Lucian Varelli, excluded as biological father. She looked up at him. He put the phone back in his pocket. I had it done at 3 in the morning. I called in favors I'd been holding for 8 years to get a result by 6. And Dominic? That test is happening today. His voice had gone to the cold, flat register that she had heard only a handful of times. I already know the answer. Lucian, don't. He held up one hand. Not aggressive, just a boundary. Don't tell me how to feel about my father right now. I am holding this together because I have to hold it together, and if you... just don't. She closed her mouth. He moved back to the chair and sat, and he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him do the things she'd watched him do in private a handful of times over 9 years. The things she'd never seen him do publicly, the visible work of a man reassembling himself from the inside out, because the situation required him to be functional, and he had decided to be functional. The regulatory situation, he said finally. His voice was back. Not all the way, but enough. Tell me where we stand. She told him. All of it, The meridian structure, the drainage, the timeline, the remediation framework she'd sent to the board and to his attorneys. She was precise and specific, and she used the same voice she'd used in 1,000 briefings across 9 years, the voice that left no room for interpretation. He listened the way he always listened when the information was critical, completely still, processing without interrupting, his eyes on her face rather than the middle distance. When she finished, he said, "The person who built the meridian structure. That wasn't Celeste." "No. She doesn't have the knowledge base for that." "No, she had help. Someone with significant financial architecture experience designed the underlying mechanism. She implemented it." She paused. "I don't know yet who designed it." "I do," he said. She waited. "There's a man. He works in real estate structuring, has been connected to my father's personal investments for 8 years. He introduced Celeste to the organization." He paused. "He's the same man who made the introduction." She thought of Petra's notes. The referral had come through a business contact of Dominic's. She hadn't followed that thread far enough. "Your father knew about the financial structure," she said. Not a question. "I don't know how much he knew. I intend to find out." "Lucian?" She kept her voice careful. "If Dominic was aware of the financial fraud in addition to everything else, that's not a family problem anymore. That's a criminal exposure that you cannot manage quietly. I know what it is. You need to turn evidence over to your attorneys today, not tomorrow, today." "I know. And Dominic needs to be removed from every company structure immediately, regardless of—" "Elena," his voice stopped her. "I know. I've known since 6 a.m. I've been making calls since 6 a.m. He looked at her with something that was exhausted and precise at the same time. "I know what needs to happen. I just—" He stopped. "Just what?" He looked at the window, at the city. "He's my father," he said. She didn't answer that. There was no answer to that. She just let it sit in the room and breathed and waited. "The remediation framework you built," he said after a moment, coming back. "Does it hold? If you implement it in the next 48 hours and cooperate fully with the investigators and demonstrate that the fraud was externally orchestrated and internally undetected due to compromised monitoring access, yes, it holds. The legitimate companies survive. The exposure is manageable. Will you present it?" The question landed with a weight she'd been expecting and had still not fully prepared for. "As an independent advisor," she said. "Not as a Varelli representative. My company, my documentation, my advisory fee at current market rate. If you're asking me to walk into those meetings as Elena from 9 years ago, the answer is no." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to do what you do, whatever title you need to do it under." "Then yes." Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly, something quieter. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. He reached into his jacket and took out an envelope, placed it on the desk between them. She looked at it without picking it up. "The Dominic test results will come back today," he said. "When they do, I'm going to need to make a decision about Nico." He paused. "The boy has no fault in any of this. He's 3 months old. Whatever happens with Dominic, Celeste, none of it should land on him." "No," Elena agreed. "It shouldn't. The envelope contains documentation I've already filed. Financial provision, legal protection, removal from the family power structure in terms of inheritance and title. Everything that prevents him from being used as a piece in whatever comes next." He looked at her. "He'll be cared for. He won't be a Varelli heir, but he'll be cared for." She looked at the envelope, then at him. "That's the right thing," she said. "It's the only thing." He stood. "I'll have my attorney contact yours about the advisory arrangement." "Fine." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Elena." She looked up. He seemed to want to say several things, and settled on none of them, or perhaps settled on something different from what he'd started with. "I know what it cost you to walk into that reception Saturday, to talk to my mother." He paused. "I know you didn't do it for me." "No. I know." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Thank you anyway." He left. She sat at her desk for a while after the sound of the elevator disappeared, not working, just sitting, which was unusual for her. She was looking at the envelope on her desk, the one he'd left about Nico, and she was thinking about a child who would grow up without understanding the specific architecture of what he'd been born into, which was probably the best possible outcome for him. She picked up the envelope, set it aside for Lucian's attorney to collect. Then she opened her laptop and got back to work. The next 48 hours were among the most sustained and technical of her professional life, which was considerable competition. She was in meetings with federal investigators for 6 hours Tuesday. She presented the remediation framework with the precision she'd built it with, answered questions without hesitation, and demonstrated through documentation that the fraud had been externally architected and internally implemented through deliberate compromise of the monitoring systems by an individual with access that had since been revoked. She was calm. She was specific. She did not use language that was defensive or that acknowledged culpability on the part of the legitimate companies or their board. The investigators were skeptical. That was their job, and she respected it. They pushed on 3 specific points: the timeline of monitoring failure, the authorization level of the access Celeste had held, and the question of whether any legitimate company officer had received unusual financial benefit during the fraud period. She answered each point with documentation. She offered voluntary cooperation that exceeded what was legally required. By the end of the Tuesday session, the lead investigator had the expression of a woman who had expected a stone wall and found instead a person handing her a detailed map of the building. Not resolved, not cleared, but beginning to look like something that could be managed, rather than something that would burn everything down. She ate dinner alone at her desk Tuesday evening. She was too tired for anything more complicated than that. Marcus called at 8. The Dominic test results came back, he said. She'd known they would today. And? Dominic is Nico's biological father. A pause. Lucian got the result at 6 p.m. She closed her eyes for a moment, not from surprise, just from the weight of confirmation. The thing that had been a very strong probability was now a documented fact, and documented facts had a different gravity from probabilities, no matter how likely. How is he, she asked, and she hated that she was asking, hated the specific vulnerability of still needing to know. I don't know, Marcus said carefully. He's functioning. He's been on calls all day, but there's... He paused. You know how he gets when something is actually bad. The kind of bad he's not going to show. She knew. Is Dominic still in the building? She asked. He was removed from headquarters this morning. Security level removal. Professional, no scene, but final. Another pause. I don't know if Lucian spoke to him before or after the test result. She didn't either. She wasn't going to ask. She hung up and sat with it for a while. The specific enormity of what it meant for a man who had organized his entire life around a particular relationship with his father to discover that that relationship had been secretly betraying him at its most fundamental level. Not a business betrayal. Not a loyalty failure in the organizational sense. Something more cellular than that. The person who was supposed to be the fixed point had been moving secretly for a long time. She thought about what that kind of discovery did to a person's ability to trust any fixed point after. She pushed the thought away and went back to work. Wednesday morning, she was called into an unscheduled meeting. Not by the investigators. By Lucian. The location was the Varelli Holdings headquarters. She hadn't been inside the building in 4 months, and walking through the lobby had the particular strangeness of a place that is deeply familiar and has nevertheless become foreign through absence. The security team recognized her. Nobody said anything about that. Lucian's office was on the top floor. She'd been in it more times than she could count. She'd been in it the night he ended things. She hadn't been in it since. He was standing when she came in. Not at the window this time. At the conference table on the side of the room, with documents spread across it. Not the organized spread of a planned meeting, but the working spread of a man who has been looking at things for hours. He looked up when she came in. He looked worse than Monday and better than Saturday, which put him somewhere in the range of a person who was sleeping in brief intervals and eating when reminded and functioning at approximately 65% of capacity, which for Lucian Varelli was still more functional than most people operating at full. Sit down, he said. She sat. He pushed a document across the table. She picked it up. Read the first page. Read the second page more slowly. It was a signed deposition, Dominic Varelli. Dated yesterday evening. She read it through. Dominic had confirmed everything. The relationship with Celeste. The introduction he had arranged into the organization. His awareness of the pregnancy and his knowledge, from before Nico's birth, that the child was his. His subsequent decision to allow Lucian to believe otherwise. His participation in, his signature on, a private agreement with the man who had designed the Meridian financial structure, executed 3 weeks after Elena's departure from the organization. He had known about the fraud, had not designed it, had not directly executed it, but had known about it and had made no move to stop it or report it. She set the document down. "He gave this voluntarily?" she asked, after I told him what I was prepared to do if he didn't. Lucian's voice was flat in a way that told her she was not going to get the details of that conversation. "He cooperated with my attorneys. He'll cooperate with the investigators. That's the right outcome. It's the outcome." He said it without any quality of satisfaction. "My attorneys have already been in contact with the federal investigation. Dominic's deposition changes the evidentiary picture significantly. The focus moves from the companies to the individuals who orchestrated the fraud. That's what the remediation framework was designed to enable." "I know." He looked at her. "You built the escape route before I knew I needed one. I built it because the companies deserved to survive, not for any other reason." He looked at the documents for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to come back." She'd been waiting for this, had known it was coming since Monday morning, had spent 2 nights deciding what she was going to say when it arrived. "No," she said. He held her gaze. "I'm not asking for, I know what you're asking for." "The answer is no." She kept her voice even. "I will complete the advisory work on the regulatory situation. I will see the remediation through to its conclusion. That's what I agreed to, and that's what I'll do." She paused. "But I'm not coming back to the organization. I'm not returning as your advisor or your consultant or any other framing of the same arrangement. I have my own company. I have my own work." "Elena, Lucian." She said his name with a precision that stopped him. "You asked me 9 years ago to stand beside something that required me to put all of myself into it. And I did. I gave it everything. And when you decided you were done, you didn't give me a conversation or a reason, or even the basic respect of honesty." She paused. "I'm not angry about that anymore. I understand why you made the choices you made, but I am not available to rebuild what we had. The professional version or any other version." He was quiet. "The work I'm doing on the regulatory situation," she continued, "I'm doing because it's right. Because those companies represent real things and real people. When that work is finished, we're done. You're not even—" He stopped. Tried again. "You're not curious about what I would have done differently, if I'd known, about the medical situation, if you'd told me." She considered that. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "It matters to me. It matters to the version of events that didn't happen. I can't live in that version." She looked at him steadily. "You need to figure out who you are without the things you lost. The air you thought you had. Your father's reliability. Me." She paused. "You have an organization to rebuild. That's going to take everything you have. That's where you should be putting it." He looked at the window. "When my father—" He stopped. "Started differently. When I was 17, there was a situation. Something that went wrong in the organization. I made a mistake that cost us significantly. And my father sat with me for 4 hours and went through every decision point and showed me exactly where I'd gone wrong and exactly what I should have done instead." He paused. He wasn't a warm man, but in that room for those 4 hours, he was completely present. He cared about making me better at something real." He stopped again. "That's the man I thought he was." Elena didn't say anything. "The man in that deposition," he said. "I don't know who that is." "He's both," she said quietly. "People usually are." Lucian turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, open in a way that his face almost never allowed, the specific openness of a man who has run out of the energy required to maintain his usual management of what shows. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the compressed, obligatory sorry of a man performing the expected ritual. The other kind. The kind that costs something to say. "For which part?" she asked. "All of it. The way I ended it, what I said at the reception, the 9 years of letting you carry something that was mine to carry." He paused. "All of it." She sat with that. "I accept that," she said. "But you're not coming back." "No." He nodded once. The nod of a man who has received information he expected and has no grounds to contest. He looked at the documents on the table. The meridian exposure, he said, moving back to business because that was how both of them handled things that had reached their limit. You moved back to the work. The timeline for full remediation. 6 to 8 weeks, assuming full cooperation from your legal team and no new exposures in the documentation. She opened her bag and pulled out the working file. The first phase needs to complete by Friday. I'll need access to the shipping company's financial records by tomorrow morning because there are 2 structures in there that I haven't fully mapped and I need to understand them before the Thursday session with the investigators. You'll have them tonight. Good. She set the file on the table between them. Let's go through the Thursday agenda. They worked for 3 hours. It was the most normal 3 hours she'd spent in proximity to him in months. Just work. Problems and solutions, and the particular rhythm of 2 people who understood each other's professional shorthand without needing to explain it. She caught him looking at her twice in a way that was not professional, and she met those looks with the neutral focus of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep it, and he read that focus correctly both times and went back to the documents. At 2 in the afternoon, she gathered her files and stood. I'll have the Thursday agenda revised and back to you by end of day, she said. Fine. She moved toward the door. Elena? She stopped, didn't turn around. The night I ended it, he said behind her. I told you there were things I needed that I hadn't been honest about needing. She waited. The air, the family. I convinced myself those were the things. He paused. I don't think those were the things. She stood with her hand near the door and she breathed and she did not turn around. I think I was afraid, he said, of how much I needed you, specifically. Not a family, not an heir, you. Another pause. And that felt like a weakness I couldn't afford, so I reframed it as something else, and I made the decision I made. The room was very quiet. That's not an argument, he said. I know it doesn't change anything. He stopped. I wanted you to know that I know what I actually lost. She stood at the door. She wanted to say several things. She said none of them. She opened the door and walked out, and she kept walking until she was in the elevator and the doors had closed, and then she stood in the small metal space between his floor and the lobby, and she pressed her back against the wall and she let herself feel, for exactly the duration of that elevator ride, the full weight of everything she was not going back to. The doors opened at the lobby. She walked out into the city, into the noise and the light, and the 10,000 ordinary things happening in every direction, and she kept walking, and by the time she reached her office, she was herself again, or the version of herself she was building, which was not the same as the version she'd been, but was hers in a way that the previous version had never fully been. She sat down at her desk. She opened the Thursday investigation file. And she worked. Because the work was real, and it was hers, and it needed to be done, and that had always been enough to go on. Had always been the thing that held when other things didn't, the floor beneath whatever else collapsed. And tonight it would be enough again. Somewhere across the city, the Dominic Varelli deposition was being reviewed by federal attorneys who would make decisions about it in the coming days. Somewhere, Celeste Arden was in a place Elena didn't know and wasn't trying to find. Somewhere, a 3-month-old boy named Nico was being held by a nanny who was steady and warm and unaware of anything except that the child in her arms was hungry and tired and needed exactly the ordinary care that children need, regardless of what their adults are doing to each other. And somewhere in a top-floor office with documents spread across a conference table, Lucian Varelli was sitting alone for the first time in a very long time, in the specific silence of a man who has finally been left with nothing but the truth about himself and is trying to figure out what to build with it. Elena looked at the file in front of her. Thursday was 2 days away. She had work to do. The Thursday session with the federal investigators ran 4 hours and 20 minutes. Elena had prepared for 3 scenarios: cooperative resolution, adversarial pushback, or the third and most dangerous kind, which was investigators who had already made up their minds and were going through the motions of discovery for procedural purposes. She'd built documentation for all 3 and walked in carrying a bag that was heavier than it looked. The lead investigator was a woman named Carla Reyes, 52, with the particular quality of someone who has spent decades in rooms with people who are not telling her the whole truth and has developed an almost physical sensitivity to the texture of partial information. She had short gray hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose and a legal pad she wrote on with a mechanical pencil, and she asked questions the way a surgeon makes incisions, precise, deliberate, designed to create exactly the opening she needed. Elena answered every question completely. Not strategically complete, actually complete, including the parts that were uncomfortable, including the admission that the monitoring failures had gone undetected for longer than they should have, because the person who had compromised them had possessed access granted by a senior family member whose authorization level had not been questioned because of his position rather than his current standing. Reyes looked at her over her reading glasses when Elena said that. "You're describing a systemic authorization failure," she said. "Yes. I'm also describing how that failure has been corrected and why the documentation supports voluntary remediation rather than ongoing concealment." Elena kept her voice level. "I'm here because the companies deserve to survive this. The employees deserve to keep their jobs. The fraud was externally architected and internally enabled by individuals who have since provided full depositions to your office." She paused. "I'm not here to protect the Varelli name. I'm here to protect the work." Reyes studied her for a moment. "You built these compliance structures originally," she said. "It wasn't on the briefing documents. She'd done her own research." "Yes." "And then you left the organization 4 months ago. And now you're back, presenting their remediation framework." "I'm presenting a remediation framework I developed as an independent advisor retained by the board. It has my company's name on it, not theirs." Elena looked at her steadily. "You can verify my departure date, my advisory contract date, and the timeline of the fraud. They don't overlap in any way that suggests I was involved in the underlying problem." Reyes made a note. The session continued. By the end of it, the framework was provisionally accepted as the basis for the ongoing investigative cooperation. Not resolved, these things were never resolved in a single meeting, but the posture had shifted from adversarial to conditional. The companies would remain operational during the investigation. Key personnel would be available for further questioning. Documentation would continue to be provided through Elena's office as the authorized advisory channel. She walked out of the federal building into afternoon light that felt genuinely surprising, as if the day had continued normally while she'd been in a room where normal things weren't happening, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the specific relief of having done something difficult and done it correctly. Her phone had 7 messages. She read them in order. 3 from Gerald, 1 from Marcus, 1 from one of the board members, 1 from a journalist she didn't know, which she deleted without reading past the first sentence, and 1 from Serafina Varelli, which she almost didn't open. "I would like to have lunch, this week, if possible. My preference is somewhere I have not been before. S." Elena read it twice, put the phone in her bag, started walking. She called Serafina back from the car. "Friday," Elena said when she answered. "There's a place in the West Village, small, good food. I'll send you the address." "Fine," Serafina said, and then before she hung up, "The session today. It went well?" "Well enough." "Good." A pause that had something in it Elena couldn't immediately identify. "Elena, thank you. For Saturday. I know that cost you something to do." "It cost less than not doing it would have." Serafina made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. "You always were sensible." Another pause. "Friday." She hung up. Elena stared at the traffic moving past the car window. Sensible. 9 years of watching that world operate, and the best word Serafina had ever offered her was sensible. She wasn't sure if it was an insult or the most genuine compliment the woman was capable of giving. She decided it was probably both and let it go. The regulatory work consumed Friday morning entirely. She was at her desk by 6:30, working through the shipping company structures she'd mapped 2 days ago, identifying 2 additional exposure points that needed documentation before the next investigative session. Her assistant arrived at 8 and found her 3 coffees deep and already deep in a financial architecture problem that required complete silence to solve, and had the good sense to simply put a 4th coffee on the corner of the desk and leave her alone. She finished the shipping documentation at 11:15. She sat back in her chair and stretched and looked at the ceiling and thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its simplicity. I'm good at this. Not as an observation she needed to prove to anyone, just as a plain fact, the way you might note that it's cold outside or that a particular road runs north. She was good at this work. She had always been good at it, And for 9 years she'd been doing it in service of someone else's name, and now it had her name on it, and that felt different in a way she hadn't fully articulated to herself until this moment. Not better, necessarily. Just true. In a way that the previous arrangement had never quite been. She closed the laptop, got her coat, walked to the West Village. The restaurant was small in the way that expensive small restaurants are. Not cramped, but precise. Everything had been chosen rather than accumulated. She'd eaten there twice before and liked it for the particular reason that nobody would recognize her there, and she'd been right about that, and she valued being right about small things as much as large ones. Serafina arrived 3 minutes after Elena, which meant she'd been outside earlier and had waited, which meant she was either more nervous about this lunch than she appeared, or she had a long habit of entering rooms 2 minutes after the first available moment, so as to never be the one waiting. Elena suspected the latter. She was wearing dark blue today. No pearls. Which was, Elena understood after a moment, a deliberate choice. The absence of the thing that had always been a fixture of Serafina's formal self was its own kind of statement about what this lunch was. They ordered without much ceremony. Serafina studied the menu for a shorter time than the menu warranted, which suggested she wasn't reading it carefully, which suggested her mind was partly somewhere else. Elena ordered what she'd ordered both previous times and watched Serafina settle into the chair across from her with the particular physicality of a woman who is making herself be still. When the server left, they sat with each other for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full. "How is he?" Elena asked. She meant Lucian. Serafina knew she meant Lucian. "Functioning," Serafina said, which, for Lucian, is most of what he does. She picked up her water glass. "He's not sleeping enough. He's working too much. He's doing what he always does when something actually damages him, which is to make himself so busy that there is no room in the day for the damage to surface." She paused. "He'll be fine. Eventually. I know. He asked me not to have this lunch." Elena looked at her. "He thought it would—" Serafina considered her words. "He was concerned it would make things more complicated. For you." "He was concerned it would make things more complicated for him," Elena said. Something shifted in Serafina's expression that was close to amusement. "Possibly. I'm glad you came anyway. I have been doing what Lucian asked for 40 years. I am 69 years old. I have some capacity for independent judgment." She set her water glass down with a precision that was, Elena had learned, the way Serafina's hands expressed what her face was more careful about. "I wanted to see you." Elena waited. "I also wanted to tell you something, which I have been deciding whether to tell you for some time, and have decided that I should, because you are one of the few people in my life who deserves information rather than managed versions of it." Elena sat very still. "When you and Lucian first when it was clear that the relationship was serious, Dominic told me he was concerned." Serafina kept her voice even and direct. The voice of someone delivering a prepared statement, which was exactly what it was. "He told me you were too capable, that a woman who could run the financial architecture of an operation like ours was a woman who eventually would not be satisfied in a supporting role." She paused. "He suggested more than once that Lucian should keep you at a professional distance, that mixing the personal and the operational created an exposure he was uncomfortable with." Elena looked at her. "I did not know then what I know now about his motivations," Serafina said. "I believed he was concerned about the organization's integrity. I understand now that he had other reasons for wanting you at a distance." Her jaw was very controlled. "He was afraid of what you might see if you were too close. He knew, even then, that you might eventually notice something he needed to keep hidden." "That is my assumption, yes." The food arrived. Neither of them moved toward it immediately. "Serafina," Elena said carefully, "did you know about Dominic and Celeste before I showed you the photographs?" The older woman looked at her with eyes that were steady and very old in the specific way that the eyes of people who have witnessed a great deal of life can be old, holding layers of experience that don't simplify with time. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I did not know what." She paused. "There are things in a marriage that you can feel the shape of without being able to name them, particularly in a marriage like ours." Another pause. "When you showed me the photographs, I was not as surprised as I perhaps should have been, and I am not sure if that is wisdom or failure." Elena looked at her and felt something move through her that was not pity and not quite grief, and was perhaps simply the particular recognition of what a long life alongside the wrong compromises costs. "It's neither," she said. "It's just what it is." Serafina looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her fork. "Eat," she said. "The food is getting cold." They ate. And somewhere in the course of that lunch, which ran longer than either of them had planned, 2 hours rather than one, with a second round of coffee appearing at some point and being consumed without discussion, they had a conversation that was unlike any conversation Elena had had with Serafina Varelli in 9 years of knowing her. Not about business, not about Lucian or Dominic or any of what had happened, about other things, about the specific texture of building something from nothing and watching it become real, about what it means to be a woman who is capable of more than the room she's been given and the choices available when you understand that, about the difference between enduring something and choosing it. Serafina talked about her own early years in a way that Elena had never heard her talk about them, not as background, not as context, but as a series of specific experiences that had cost her specific things and had built her into what she was, and had left marks that didn't disappear with time. Elena listened, and when she talked, which was less than Serafina but more than she'd expected, she found herself saying things she'd thought but not spoken, about the 9 years, about the decision to stay silent about the medical file, about the specific nature of a mistake you make out of love that becomes, over time, a kind of trap. "I told myself it was kindness," she said, "protecting him from something that would hurt him. I believed that. I think it was partly true. And the other part? The other part was that I knew, if he found out, that it would change something. The dynamic between us. The way he thought about things. I was afraid of what it would change." She looked at her coffee. "I chose my fear over his truth. That's what it was." Serafina was quiet for a moment. "We do that," she said. "Women in our particular circumstances. We manage the truth of the people we love because we understand, usually correctly, that they are not managing it themselves. And we tell ourselves it is care. And sometimes it is care." She paused. "And sometimes it is how we make ourselves necessary. And the two things are very hard to tell apart from the inside." Elena looked at her. "You are not the only one who should have said something sooner," Serafina said. "I want you to know that." They sat with that for a moment. Then Elena said, "How are you, actually?" Serafina was quiet long enough that the ambient noise of the restaurant became briefly audible. Other tables, the specific low hum of a room full of people having their own conversations. "I have been married for 41 years to a man I believed I knew," she said. "I did not know him as completely as I thought. That is—" She stopped, chose her next words with the care of someone who has very few available that are adequate. "That is a particular kind of grief. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that you discover in small increments, in the particular silences of a room, in the way certain memories shift their meaning when you look at them again with new information." She paused. "I am managing it." "I'm sorry," Elena said. "Don't be sorry for me." Serafina said it without heat. "I am 69 years old. I have survived things that would have broken other people. This will not break me either." She looked at Elena steadily. "But I appreciate the intention." They parted outside the restaurant in early afternoon light. Serafina had a car waiting, so she always had a car waiting, and Elena had planned to walk the 20 blocks back to the office because she needed the movement and the cold air and the 20 minutes of being in the city without having to think about anything specific. Serafina put her hand briefly on Elena's arm before she got into the car. "Build your company," she said. "Don't let anyone put you in a supporting role again. You are not built for it." Elena looked at her. "I know," she said. Serafina nodded once, got in the car, left. Elena walked back to the office in the cold and thought about nothing in particular and felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, something that was close to settled. The regulatory work resolved itself over the following 6 weeks, in the way that complicated things resolve when the groundwork is solid. Not dramatically, not with a single definitive moment, but through a series of smaller determinations that accumulated into a final position. The federal investigation concluded that the fraud had been externally orchestrated and internally enabled by individuals who were no longer associated with the companies and who had provided full cooperation with authorities. The legitimate companies would face enhanced oversight for a period of 18 months, no criminal exposure for the board or the operational staff. The Meridian intermediaries were a different matter. They faced their own proceedings, which were not Elena's concern and which she didn't track beyond what was publicly reported. Dominic Varelli's cooperation had been extensive enough to matter and was reflected in the investigation's final characterization. What happened to Dominic personally, his marriage, his position, his relationship with his son, was not Elena's to know in detail, and she made a deliberate choice not to seek those details. She heard through Marcus that Serafina had moved to the Connecticut house and that Dominic remained in the city. The specific legalities of what that meant were their own matter. She heard, also through Marcus, who remained a careful and reliable source of information about a world she was no longer part of, that Lucian had restructured the organization significantly. Several captains had been removed. Several arrangements had been renegotiated. The empire was smaller, and by Marcus's account, considerably tighter, operated with a discipline that the previous, larger version had sometimes lacked because its size had allowed certain things to go unexamined. Marcus said this with a tone that suggested he considered it an improvement, and Elena believed him because Marcus had the kind of judgment that came from watching the same institution from the inside for a long time. She finished the remediation advisory work on a Thursday, sent the final documentation to Gerald, to the board members, to the investigator's office as required, wrote a short final report summarizing the completed framework and the current status of each component, sent it to Lucian's attorney. Did not send it to Lucian directly. Did not hear from Lucian directly, which was what she'd asked for and what she'd been given, and she tried to feel only the appropriate things about that: relief and the particular cleanness of a concluded professional arrangement, and mostly succeeded. Mostly. Marlowe Strategic Holdings had 6 clients by the end of the remediation period. 3 were small to mid-sized companies with financial structure problems that needed systematic attention. 1 was a private equity firm that had hired her to assess due diligence protocols before a significant acquisition. 2 were the original clients who had come to her in the first weeks, both of whom had expanded the scope of their engagement based on what she'd accomplished for them. Her assistant had been joined by 2 additional staff. The 14th floor office had acquired a second conference room that was in use more days than not. She was building something. It was hers. It was real. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, the kind of evening when the light stays longer than expected and the city feels briefly like a more forgiving version of itself. She was working late when her phone rang. Lucian. She looked at the name on the screen for 2 rings, answered on the 3rd. "The investigation closed," he said. No preamble. His voice was tired, but not the desperate tired of the weeks after the wedding. Something more settled. "I know. Gerald sent me the formal closure notification this morning. I wanted to thank you, directly, not through attorneys." She leaned back in her chair. Outside the windows, the city was doing its evening thing, lights beginning to matter more as the sky darkened, the particular density of Manhattan at 6 p.m. "The companies are in better shape than they would have been," she said. "That was the goal." "It was your goal," he said. "I know the difference." She didn't argue with that. "How's the organization?" she asked. Because she was asking about the work, not about him, or she was asking about both and choosing to frame it as the former, which was its own kind of honesty. "Smaller, cleaner." A pause. "Some of the people who stayed are better suited to what I'm building than what I had before. And some of the people who left needed to leave years ago. It just took..." He stopped. "It took a disaster to make the right thing happen. That's an expensive way to get there." "Usually is." "Nico is living in Connecticut," he said, shifting without transition. "There's a trust set up in his name, managed independently, has nothing to do with the organization or the family structure. The nanny is staying on. He'll be provided for. Well provided for." Another pause. "I see him sometimes." Elena said nothing. "I know that's..." He seemed to be searching for the right word. "It's what you decided," she said. "That's enough." "He's a good baby." The observation came out with a simplicity that was nothing like the complicated thing behind it. "He doesn't know anything. He sleeps, and he wakes up, and he wants what he wants, and everything that happened around him is completely irrelevant to his experience of being alive." Another pause. "I find that..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Clarifying," she offered. A beat. Yeah. They were quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people who have run out of things to say, but the quieter kind. The kind between two people who have said most of the important things and are sitting in the space after. I got the DNA result, he said. The Dominic confirmation. I know. It didn't. I thought it would feel different, having the confirmation versus just knowing. He paused. It felt exactly the same, just with a piece of paper attached. How is he, Dominic? A silence that lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. He is what he is, Lucian said finally. He's the man who did what he did, and he's also the man who taught me things that made me who I am. And those two things exist simultaneously, and I cannot make them not exist simultaneously, no matter how much I would prefer a simpler version. His voice was flat in a way that was not anger, but was the compressed residue of it, the what anger becomes after it has been processed for months without resolution. I don't know what we are to each other now. I don't know if there's a word for what a father and son are after something like that. He paused. I stopped trying to find one. That's probably right, she said. He asked about you. She didn't expect that. He asked how you were doing, what you'd built. He said, Lucian started again. He said you were the one person in all of this who acted with integrity from the beginning. That's the word he used, integrity. She sat with that for a moment, let it move through her without grabbing at it. He also said, Lucian continued, that he was afraid of you from the beginning, not personally, professionally, that you could see structures too clearly, that you were the kind of person who noticed when something didn't fit. He paused. He wasn't wrong about that. No, she said. He wasn't. You saw it in the photographs outside the Cavendish. I saw something that didn't fit. I found out what it was. If you hadn't... He stopped. I know. I would have stood at that reception and declared that child my heir and the foundation of everything I was building, and I would have been completely wrong, and I would have never known, and eventually... He didn't finish. Eventually, the financial fraud would have surfaced on its own, without the remediation framework in place, and the outcome would have been significantly worse. She kept her voice even. Yes, I know. That's not what I was going to say. She waited. I was going to say that I would have spent the rest of my life building towards something that wasn't real, and I would have thought I would have believed I was doing the right thing, making the right choices. He paused. And the worst part is that I would have been happy. In the way that you're happy when you're not looking at something clearly. The room was very quiet around her. That's a specific kind of unhappiness, she said finally, finding that out. Yes, but it's better than the alternative. Is it? Yes, she said. It is. Because the real thing, even when the real thing is terrible, is something you can actually work with. You can build on true ground. You can't build on anything else, no matter how good it looks. He was quiet for a moment. Elena. Lucian. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that before I say this. I'm not asking to revisit anything or change anything you've decided. I know what you decided, and I know why, and I'm not... He stopped. I just want to say that I know what I had. I know it clearly now in a way I didn't know it when I had it. And I know that's... He paused. I know that's the price I paid, for the choice I made. And it's the right price. She closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, she said. It is. Another silence. Your company, he said. I hear things, even when I'm not trying to. I know you do. It's good work. Yes. You're building something real. I am. She could hear him breathe on the other end of the line, the slow, controlled breath of a man who has arrived at the end of what he prepared to say and is deciding whether to improvise. I hope it's everything, he said. Just that. I hope it's everything. She looked at the city outside her windows, the lights that were fully committed to being lights now, the sky having given over to the particular dense blue of a city evening. Below, 14 floors down, the ordinary continuing life of a street that did not know or care what was happening in the office above it. It will be, she said. She meant it. They said goodbye without ceremony. The call ended the way things between them had always ended when the professional matter was resolved. Cleanly, without ambiguity, neither of them prolonging something that had reached its natural end. She set the phone on the desk. She sat for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and went back to the due diligence assessment for the equity firm, which was due Friday and had 2 sections she hadn't completed. And she worked until 9 p.m. with the focused attention of someone who has found that work is not an escape from life, but a form of it. The specific, serious form of living that happens when you put your actual self into something real and watch it become more than it was. She ate dinner at her desk. It wasn't a sad dinner, it was just dinner at a desk, which is what happens when work runs late and you're hungry and the restaurant downstairs does good takeout. She thought about Serafina in Connecticut, managing a grief that had no clean shape. She thought about Nico in whatever room he was sleeping in tonight, unaware of any of it, building his interior life from scratch the way all infants do. She thought about Lucian in his smaller, cleaner, tighter organization, building toward something he'd said he hoped would be real this time. She did not think about what might have been, because what might have been was the least useful category of thought available to her, and she had always been a person who allocated her attention to useful things. She thought about Marlowe's strategic holdings, about the 6 clients, about the 2 staff who had joined and were good at what they did and came in each morning with the particular energy of people who believe the work matters, about the 14th floor in the conference room and her name on the door, about the next client she'd take on, and the problem after that, and the one after that, the long sequence of difficult, real, interesting problems that she was in a position to solve because she had spent 9 years building expertise inside one of the most complex operational environments she was ever likely to encounter, and had then spent 9 months building a company that was entirely hers, and was now standing at the beginning of something that had no ceiling she could currently identify. She finished the due diligence sections at 9:17 p.m. She sent them to her assistant to review in the morning. She closed her laptop. She stood, stretched, walked to the window. Manhattan at 9:30 p.m. was not the city of the morning or the city of noon. It was its own thing, lit and purposeful and indifferent to any individual story happening inside it. The river was somewhere out there beyond the buildings, doing what rivers did regardless of what the city built along its banks. The bridges were lit. Traffic moved in the slow, determined way of city traffic that has accepted its own pace. She stood at the window for several minutes. She was thinking about a conversation she'd had in the first week after the separation with her oldest friend, a woman named Jo, who was a physician and had no connection to any of it, and who had sat across from Elena in a kitchen in Brooklyn and said, with the directness of a person who has known you long enough to skip the softening, "You gave that man the best of yourself for 9 years. What are you going to do with what's left?" Elena had not had an answer then. She thought she had one now. She was going to use it. The best of herself. The parts that remained. The capability and the clarity and the hard-won knowledge of what she could build and how and under what conditions. She was going to use all of it for things that had her name on them. Companies that needed what she could see. Problems that required someone who understood how systems actually worked rather than how they were supposed to work. People who were trying to build something real and needed help making it structurally sound. She was not going to wait for someone to give her a room large enough for what she was. She was going to build the room. She turned from the window. She picked up her bag, put on her coat, turned off the desk lamp and the overhead light, and walked to the door. She paused at the door and looked back at the office in the dark. The desk, the files, the city still visible through the windows, the small framed thing on the wall that was the Marlowe Strategic Holdings letterhead from the first document she'd ever produced under that name, which she'd kept because it was the first thing that was only hers. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned off the last light and walked out into the hall and took the elevator down and stepped out onto the street. The city was cold and moving and fully alive around her. She walked. Not toward anything specific, not away from anything specific, just through it, through the particular density and noise and light of a city that had contained her entire adult life and that she knew better than she would ever know most things. She thought about what Serafina had said at the restaurant. "You are not built for a supporting role." She thought about what Lucian had said on the phone. "I hope it's everything." She thought about the woman she'd been 9 years ago, walking into the first meeting with a criminal organization and understanding within 40 minutes that she could see exactly what they were doing wrong and exactly how to fix it, and feeling, beneath the appropriate caution, beneath the rational assessment of what she was involving herself in, the specific pull of a problem large enough to deserve her full attention. She'd given 9 years to that problem. The problem had resolved itself. She was 34 years old. She had, by any reasonable calculation, a significant amount of working life ahead of her. Time enough to build something she hadn't yet imagined. Time enough for problems she hadn't yet encountered. Time enough for the kind of work that builds slowly enough that you don't notice it becoming what it is until the day you step back and find you're standing in front of something real. A woman passed her going the other direction, walking fast, coat pulled against the cold, face forward, entirely elsewhere in her own life. Elena walked on. She wasn't happy in the simple, uncomplicated way of someone who has gotten what she wanted because she hadn't gotten what she wanted, or she'd gotten a version of it that was different from the version she'd planned for, constructed of different materials, costing things she hadn't expected to pay. But she realized, as she turned onto her block and saw the familiar geography of her street, something more durable than happy. She was clear. She knew what she was building and why and for whom. She knew what she'd lost and what she'd learned from losing it, and what she was never going to sacrifice again for the comfort of someone else's certainty. She knew her own name and what it meant and what she intended it to mean. That was not nothing. That was, she thought, climbing the steps to her building, the key in her hand, the city continuing its nighttime business behind her. That was, in fact,